Morrow of the Golden Age, Chapter 28. As I began my last chapter with a rising of arms around Mesopotamia, I must do so again, and this time I will not give the perpetrators the benefit of pointing out their honourable intentions. It was only the whim of Seleucid King Doreius that his disgrace of recent years could be undone and then cast as an evil overcome. So eager was he to bring this story about that the true ending of such rousing he did not foresee. Indeed, he was far from the battlefront, having fled to Arabia, where Seleucid treaties brought out new men to fight from the merchant posts that fostered adventurous sorts. There was a long war here that I will describe in pieces, because it was characterized by a lack of leadership from the aforementioned Doreius, leading to a general state of hostility with no particular campaign being pressed. The Seleukids had an army stationed close to Charax at the Tigris Delta, and Dion searched and sleuthed for them across the marshes for months at a time. Comparing the records of each, it seems they passed by each other several times, and the one time Dion found himself in position to advance into battle, he was waylaid by the drunkenness of his men. This was an example he had been setting with celebration and aplomb ever since his arrival in the east, so there is hardly any blame to allot to the rank and file. Witness Aeneas made a reluctant march to secure all of the trade routes south of the Hyrcanian Ocean, and did so easily. This gave him direct communication with Prince Darius, allowing them to coordinate a simultaneous attack on Persia and Arabia, such that at least one of them should succeed. With the Seleukids being in a state of disarray and blindness to their peril, that both should succeed was well within reason also. All in all, the simple movement of troops here and there constituted the first year of the new war, that being 162 prior, a telling departure from the years of energetic conquest at the previous climax. Far away at Apollon, Pairisades was wintering the Lothosis and resolving the endless disputes with local temples about indignities the Scions of Gold venturing from the city were said to have committed. There was little distinction between true and false claims of this kind, so the king's work was to establish a method to bring reason and legal standards into the discussion, so that all people could be satisfied that they were in order, and all grievances were accounted for and righteous, even if they were unresolved. Amid this he received embassy from Rome. The Romans brought sad news that his eldest daughter Labda had perished in Gallia. She was supposedly attached to the camp of Sextus Caesar for some unspecified and likely insufferable reason, resulting in her exposure to illnesses she was no longer able to bear. The king was not angry, and nor did he have time to be. The Roman embassy had actually delivered this news as a mere side plate to their real issue, which was that dictator Gaius Caesar had taken offence to the outcome of the Symposium of Free Peoples I described previously. The indictment was that many prisoners and hostiles of the Roman wars in Gallia had fled to reside among tribes who were now tied to the Bosporan Empire through military treaty. In Roman tradition, it was considered a military act to take any benefit from the harbouring of Rome's enemies, and so it was that the embassy calmly laid out an ultimatum. Their messenger lifted a rosette of leaves preserved in resin and said, "Should it be that the empires who lay on either side of Rome's rosette are now at war?" This was an astonishingly brazen thing to say, and the court at Apollon was inclined to accept the invitation for war only because the invitation itself was enraging. The king did not fall for these things, and instead diverted the topic of discussion back to the arrangements for Labda's funerary respects, implying that the answers given would in some way preface his more important answer to the Roman taunt. Once he found that all was quite proper in that regard, he returned to the pressing matter by agreeing to find all the men the Romans wished and gift them as unpaid-for slaves to the house of Caesar. This was a gross violation of the spirit he had engendered in Germania, of this there is no doubt, but I think the dishonour lies with Rome, whose insistence upon others respecting their questionable military customs is the root cause of this and other terrors ongoing in Europe in that generation. Pairisades then went forward and took the Roman rosette for himself, saying, "I shall take this to its proper place so that we cannot have war." The Romans protested at this, at which Pairisades said that he would only agree to what he had previously said if the delegation leave immediately, because he intended to quit the city himself without delay. Thus there was little hospitality offered, and the coldness of these events awoke those sleeping through history to the nature of the world as it was then, divided between two huge and purposeful empires, albeit the Roman purpose was a strange and violent one. As explained in other works, their eradication of Gallia was complete by 162 prior, which explains why they were bashing on the doors of Germania for more life to extinguish. Many people had always thought the Romans were like this because they were inherently violent. However, we know that upon considered analysis, there is hardly such a thing as a trait inherent to a person. To put it another way, all people can change to be all things, and it will seem as if they have always been that way to any fresh eyes that fall upon them afterwards. We know that the Romans were hardly as bad as they had become before the rising of the Caesar family to power, but there is another cause too. The fact that the revelations of Pairisades and all the truth of the Golden Age had driven the Romans to seek practical knowledge of the past in a similar way, and their success was vitally flawed, such that they saw the ways of good order to be something very different to what Manos and the Paragon deities demonstrate. They advocated for the depopulation of parts of the world they did not prefer, because they insisted that the evil of the gods was enhanced by the existence of so many people. This is what they held to have been the cause of the Golden Age ending. People became so many that their power could never return to the earth, and so it was taken by the cosmos instead. This gave the gods the power to grow closer, lessening the distance from soil to the sphere they are peeking at us through. All these things were merely claimed without proof, because the Romans were extremely reluctant to show anyone the purported runestones that recorded these discoveries. Similarly, it was only after decades of carrying out their foul deeds that explanations such as the above were offered through diplomatic channels. Even then, the Latinate way of making everything sound like a spurious rhetorical argument gave plenty of pause to those who might have believed an honest-sounding or agnostic deposition. There shall be more to say on this in time. Know now, though, that the king was aware of the Roman ambition, folly or faithful as it may be, and understood the change to the course of the world that the death of his daughter was to bring. Because he knew this so well, he carried that rosette as quickly as he could to leave the citadel at Apollon and join the Lithosis in their pastures. They would accompany him further as he rode for the coast. It was time for the king to be in the company of his son, who would bear the weight of all that was due to happen to the world upon his shoulders. Since this journey was long, on account of the need to procure many ships suitable for the Lithosis, and none dared challenge their right to go on this journey, we shall presently consider intermediate events in the second year of Hyros's war. In the spring of 161 prior, Doreius led an expedition of levied men to capture a large town on the Euphrates River called Hirta. The Seleucid garrison there made brief theatrics by withdrawing to their citadel and refusing to negotiate, only to surrender some weeks later when Dion also arrived with his veteran men. With this, the Seleucid domain was removed entirely from the fertile rivers. This region remained under threat though, because so many of the cities of Arabia, which are poorly documented, were paying tribute to Hyros, and elite families were lending him men in mercenary fashion, hoping to secure commercial dominance should the large cities to their north change hands once again. Hence Doreius and Dion moved to watch the main road from Aravia to Charax, at the junction of marshes and desert. They were joined by Dion's two sons, Zeuxis and Zeno, who Dion had taken under his wing to teach worldly ways in precisely the same manner as Dion had enjoyed under Spartacus. Doreius had seen no such luxury, and likewise did not offer it to his own offspring, who had remained in Philippopolis when they were not touring Scions of Gold sites as part of their education. Zeuxis was married to a Seleucid noblewoman in the autumn, providing some festivities for the otherwise unengaged soldiers who disliked having to guard a road devoid of life for most of the campaigning season. Their luck would turn then, because at the end of it all, the Seleucids proved to have been moving an army up this very road, month by month, swelling its size and wealth of stores for a grand campaign. Most likely they were aware that the Bosporans would meet them at the figurative gates, so both sides were committed to a large battle to decide the matter before the winter. At Dion's behest, the army was moved to encamp further south, such that the enemy would encounter resistance earlier than expected. The effect of this is hard to judge, for the Seleukids approached the battle in a stoic and professional manner that conceals their opinion of their fate. We know that in the clash that came, both sides adopted the same strategy. Firstly, they stationed their main forces on the road that linked the opposing camps. This was a path of compacted earth with waystones sometimes placed beside it, so do not imagine something more significant. While these groups of roughly equal size were made to endure the heat of the day, both armies deployed contingents into the sandy hills that flanked the road. These detachments could not see the main battlefield, and the regular oscillation of dunes blocked their view to the front also. All must have been surprised to find that their opponents were suddenly coming at them from the other direction. This surprise was more bitter for the Seleukids though, whose men were mostly on foot and rather lost, contrasting the Bosporan men who had steppe horses or camels. 2 large skirmishes took place on either side of the main battlefield, and the Bosporans won both so easily that the reports of the day scarcely mention how it was done. Notably, the Seleukid account would have it that the whole Bosporan army had been involved in this maneuver, criticizing them for the indignity of this. I dismiss this as lightly as they claim it. In short order, the nearest Seleukid camp was taken. However, Doreius went personally to repurpose the troops for a menacing approach on the enemy's rear in the evening. With this arranged, the Bosporans were happy to commit to battle. The Seleukids must have deduced that their gambit had been checked and overcome, and that was a damning prospect, for there was no place they could reposition to in hope of restoring advantage. So then their phalanxes were hardly employed amid a chaotic tide of Bosporan attacks, and their commanders were caught and slain. Some say Dion killed the leading officer personally and gifted the torn armor of his foe to Zeuxis as a celebration of his manhood. But Doreius says that it was the general body of footmen who achieved this. Crushed, without any room for doubt, the Arabian Seleukid revival was already over, having not yet begun. The main armies could return to their bases in Mesopotamia, admittedly too late to support the harvest, and only on the understanding that they would soon be called on again. The people were happy to agree to this, seeing how easily victory had come when they placed their faith in the wise-seeming foreigners, and even some Seleukid loyalists were made to face how deficient in prospects their old masters were. During the winter, witness Aeneas had extended his patrolling of the roads in northern Persia, finding that the Seleukids did not reply to an advance he made to the city straddling the desert highlands and inhabited veins of the eastward road to Bactria, which was called Aspandana. After discovering this weakness, he was able to convince Alcestis to come from Arbela and join a storm of the city walls. This was broadly successful, and the city fell without an army arriving to contend for it. Since Aeneas had developed a reputation as a diviner on account of his unique affliction, many high-ranking families were almost pulling at the leash to have him become their governor, and usually addressed him as Strategos Basileus. This was not too much of a deviation from what his actual title of witness entailed. For his own part, he spoke only when spoken to, and had become a very unsuitable ruler who was as afraid of his own court as he was now of battle. Yet almost no one seemed to think this of him. Only the Scions of Gold who visited from the west give honest report, while their comrades from the east claim that he was enduring a metamorphosis into a wellspring of cosmic power, hence his inability to control his own character. There are those who believe both sides, and personally I have not yet been convinced of the more extreme of these two explanations. Following all this, the war Hoiros had callously started had cost him 2 important cities and a large field army by the end of the second year, while the Bosporans had only cemented themselves even further in the eyes of the conquered peoples. And for all that, it was in the 3rd year of the war that the real Bosporan offensive began. This was the result of much preparation in the captured cities, from Aspandana to Antiochia, with supplies and troops fit for a conquest of Persia being raised from all the people who could be spared from the ongoing work of rebuilding civilization and housing those volunteering to join the empire. Then, to garnish the 10,000 men prepared in this war, 2,000 Luthosis escorted King Pairisades down the Tigris. The king had traversed the world, his world, and come to the realm entrusted to his eldest son. He was there to make soothing war, but in tandem to make the abolishment of war his family's creed. Both could put him at ease. His long meditations on the state of his empire had made his journey from Europe to Persia like the transition from youth to elder. He had seen the places he had once been, the people he had believed in, and reflected in them was the dream he had espoused to all, the dream of ancient secrets made true and perfect purpose delivered. Sadly, all of these things he had seen did not allow him to think any differently of the loss he had sustained in its making. The soldiers, friends, and family members who had been taken from him, including most of his children and loved ones, were now of the earth he walked upon, and he felt that this, as natural a thing as it may be, was a sting against his grandiose vision. He had always thought more of the Lithosis truths than was strictly warranted, and in recent years had let his personal losses bring him away from one delusion and into another, that his efforts had been for naught. So ludicrously untrue is this that many historians dismiss reports of the king's disposition as propaganda or error, and yet I personally think he was honest in his depression. This also helps explain his attitude upon his reunion with the frontier princes, which is too well documented to pass off as malicious fancy. In Salukia, he was greeted in the Eastern style, with lavish demonstrations of submission and gifts beyond use for any mortal man. Dismissing or returning them, and causing great offence and diminishing of his own status for doing so, he summoned Doreius and Dion to hold court in the Temple of Ishtar, who was the oldest god known to the city. This reunion was businesslike in the beginning, with reports being delivered by the officers in question and reliable witnesses, so that the king could understand the attitude of the eastern provinces. After this, he said, "A great many years ago I told my father that I would leave his court without interest in obtaining permission, and then return only when I would bring a glorious and relieving surprise to the hearts of my people. What I did, instead, was to learn how close our world had come to its end, and how vast the task of righting it would be. The gods, entertained by me at first, gave me victory, conquest, riches, and whatever else I decided I would need, and then they gave me the very spells that were always to be their undoing. We know the motives of the gods to be, in aggregate, sinister, so why did they play me to the front of history? It was because they wished to make an example of the kind of man they sought to defeat in their opposition of the Golden Age. Yes, I say it. Stay yourselves and listen. To be a true man of gold, to wear the crown that weighs as much as all the people beneath it, is to be stripped of humanity. To aspire to gold in a world that as of yet has it not, is to experience only a flash of the happiness Manos intended, and all the wash of the misery our collective failure secretes. We were too quick to kill and bleed because we could not achieve enough. To even begin to restore the world, we must be ready to restore it entirely, all at once, for the misery of being touched by magic and then abandoned in turn is too much for living beings to bear. I say this to you with every moment of my memory intact and flowing freely to my tongue. We have defied the gods and adopted their many curses as tattoo marks upon our bodies, and the world remains in utter disrepair. That is why I came to warn you, princes, that you should not look to your own lives for salvation, nor to your children or theirs. The conditions of a golden age are not ones we are any longer disposed to adopt, and it will be the finest tyrant in all of history who manages to bash us into the final blissful sleep the tripartite prepared in the beginning. I wish I had been that tyrant, knowing I would never have come this far if I had. And so, I warn you to hold that spirit of tyranny in your hearts if you are serious in your work. If you are not, let the gods speak for all it is worth, and bring your people happiness in the short time they live, be it for a sorrowful end to our world, or simple slavery to its endless rhythms." Doreius, who had already been eager to rise from his seat and speak, immediately took the floor and pushed others away to achieve the rostra. He proclaimed, "If every person in the world knew what kind of future is possible, they would work alongside us without any regrets. Nobody fully grasps where this world came from, where we came from, and what we were always meant to be. We struggle against that and listen to the gods because that is all we have ever known. And you, Father, you are not immune to this. You do not know what the Golden Age will be like, Neither do I. These are not things we can know. All we can know is that we have our human nature, and that nature is to be orderly, to be kind, to be as the paragons were, to value life above all else, to cherish death for the life it carries away, and the strength it gave to those who still fight for our world. This nature tells us what we always were, and it screams at us because we are now striving to be different. That is folly, and it is the sure knowledge that we were created by loving beings that lets us fall into the blissful knowledge of life's simple truths. And to all skeptics I swear, one day we shall defeat the gods, and we shall suddenly, all at once, realize that this whole drama of history had a grand purpose after all. I know nothing except that what I say here is true. No, I know one more thing. I know what I must do. Therefore, for all your misgivings, Father, I shall be a true king. Whatever it is we do not know of how to save this world, I will find it, if that be possible. And if it be not possible, we shall employ 1 million souls without rest to discover it. Suffering is not of our world, and it shall be vanquished when the cosmos and the earth are split at last, and gold reigns supreme. I will give up everything for it, and I shall command anyone my junior to do the same. This energized rebuttal moved the court and cowed the king to silence. No other speaker wished to come forward and carry on this topic, so all were made to listen to Dion laughing at the scene with his famous barking convulsions. I include this exchange here to illustrate how close the Spartakids came to experiencing doubts, and how it was rejection of the veracity of doubt itself that propelled Doreius to surface above it all and cement his convictions so firm that his own father and king could not assail them. Some will say that the engendering of this spirit in Doreius was the purpose of all the misery and distant regret that Pairisades was enduring as father to his fiery heir. Since the gods were involved in shaping both, I do not think we can say what they intended, only that human spirit seemed to be keeping history on a course the gods abhorred. The most notable rumour surrounding this meeting was that Pairisades had intended to return the primacy of the royal line to the side of Spartacus. In other words, he wished Dion to be the heir, because Dion had qualities that would make him a fine tyrant of a vast empire, and I do not mean that disparagingly. He was also, in the king's eyes, the embodiment of his elder brother, for whom Pairisades had always felt guilt for replacing, no matter how proper it was. The most important lesson from our perspective is how Doreius handled this delivery of trauma, because it was Doreius who was best educated on what the Golden Age rulers had been like, and who knew the most of the paragons. And so if we are to take anything away from all this, it should be firstly that we are lucky Doreius got his way, and secondly that we should seek to model our lives more closely on his. Moving on from the courtly dramatics, the course of history remained the same. The Seleukids were doomed, and the Bosporans were set to rise yet further. Even if the king was unsure in his own mission, he was willing to bring his Lithoses to the front lines to harass the Seleukids during the year 160, while the princes prepared armies to strike deep into Persia, and also dealt with ongoing brigandry along the Euphrates, which Dion used as a chance to take fresh slaves and send them back to Palestine. In my next chapter, I will have the duty of describing to you how this war was brought to its conclusion, and be made to face greater conclusions that presently came about for the Bosporan Empire. Let us remember the words of Doreius well as we proceed.